Welcome into Words with Wallace. I'm your host, Nick Wallace, coming at you. It is Monday, May 20th. What is up, everybody? We are one day out from the end of one of the best round twos that I can remember. We had two game sevens yesterday. Of course, the Knicks Pacers series, followed by the end of the Wolves Nugget series. Of course, we are going to recap round two, talk about everything we saw yesterday and all the games before that. But before we get into that, first of all, I have to apologize. Basically missed a full week. I am going to blame my trip to Boston to see Connor a couple weeks ago. That was a blast. Was in the building for a Celtics game that we are going to talk about. Not one that was very memorable for that matter, but that being said, it kind of threw me off. Had a lot to get caught up on last week. So really unacceptable of me to miss a week during the playoffs. So that's on me. But honestly, there was a lot of hoops on. What can I say, man? I'm trying to watch all the games, certainly as much basketball as possible. So wanted to be pretty authentic and just figured it'd be better off waiting till the end of round two to give you my recap. And I'm glad I waited, man, because it did not disappoint with the games yesterday. And especially the second game, man. I cannot wait to talk about Wolves Denver. But again, before we get into that, we are going to, of course, recap round two. We are going to be doing a full preview of the conference finals in both the East and the West. But I have some notes to catch up on, right? It's been a couple weeks since I've talked to you guys. So wanted to kind of fly around and just hit on some of the big headlines that we missed in the past couple of weeks. I wanted to quickly talk about the NBA coaching carousel because I know a couple of weeks ago I mentioned that the Lakers did fire Darvin Ham. They are still looking to fill that coaching vacancy. I'm sure that's going to get a bunch of headlines, and they probably will wait until after the finals at this point in time. I'm sure it's going to get a bunch of run as a primary storyline as far as NBA headlines go once the NBA finals is over with. But we did have another notable coach firing to talk about, and that is Suns coach Frank Vogel. This is one I really didn't agree with. I felt like of the laundry list of issues that the Suns were dealing with all season long, I don't know really how you point at Coach Frank Vogel and say that he was the problem. I just feel like, especially with the matchup and knowing what we know now about the Minnesota Timberwolves, like their 4 through 7 on that roster, 4 through 8, whatever, is really unacceptable. Really, their 3 through 7 is just really horrible, especially compared to a team like Minnesota. So they were really outmatched in that series, and all season long, they're dealing with a bunch of different guys in and out of the rotation. I think all of their big three missed a significant amount of games, especially Bradley Beal. So it felt like Frank Vogel, being a guy who, of course, was the head coach of the Los Angeles Lakers when they won that bubble title in 2020, he's just had a really bad couple of years, a couple of bad beats for him to get fired just from the coach of being the Lakers. It's just such a shit show, especially with LeBron there. Like, felt like he was victim of a tough circumstance when he got fired by the Lakers, and then here he is again getting fired by the Phoenix Suns. But that's already done, and they've actually already filled that spot, and they've hired Coach Mike Budenholzer. I find that to be hilarious. I know I have some Bucks fans that feel very strongly that Coach Bud is a great head coach, which I don't doubt, but if you're going to poke holes at Vogel and say that his lack of adjustments during the Minnesota series was on full display, well, boy, oh boy, Suns fans, buckle up, because you're getting the known coach that simply doesn't make any adjustments. Whatever he determines is the game plan heading into a series, heading into a particular matchup, he is very well known for just sticking with that game plan at all costs. There are some coaches out there that are on the other side of the spectrum that over-adjust, that move away from their game plan a little too quickly, but Mike Budenholzer is not one of them. Of course, he was the coach of the Milwaukee Bucks, won a championship in 2021 with the Bucks as well. So they just went from the 2020 head coach champion to the 2021 head coach championship in Phoenix, and we will have to monitor next year how that works out for them. So moving on, we also had basically all of the NBA awards announced over the past couple weeks. I think at the time of recording this, the only thing that hasn't been announced yet is, of course, the NBA first, second, and third teams, if I'm not mistaken. They did come out with all rookie. It was exactly chalk. I think I predicted it. You know, the top 10 players were exactly what I said. And with all of the major individual awards, that was all chalk as well. It was really not eventful or exciting whatsoever, but I did just want to at least mention that basically all the favorites won, right? Of course, Jokic came away with MVP, Gobert Defensive Player of the Year, Wembanyama Rookie of the Year, Naz Reid Sixth Man, Tyrese Maxey Most Improved, Steph Clutch Player of the Year, Mark Dagnall Coach of the Thunder was Coach of the Year, and then Brad Stevens was Executive of the Year as well. Really not relevant. I think all those guys are super deserving, and honestly, all the guys on this list that have been in the postseason have been extremely impressive. And I know that although it's not fair, and these are, again, regular season awards that are just announced during the postseason, people love to be like, oh, this is your MVP. Oh, this is your Defensive Player of the Year. And we just saw a lot of that in the past series, and we will continue to see a lot of that narrative and those storylines being floated around over the next few weeks. But really, the only relevance of this is just watching the Jokic haters line up now that they are out of the playoffs. Spoiler alert. Of course, they did lose to Minnesota yesterday, and we're going to be talking all about that. But Jokic is still very deserving of that MVP. I personally would have given it to Luka, but I thought it was, you're kind of splitting hairs at that point. So wanted to at least put a bow on the award season as those have all been announced, and maybe I'll give my thoughts if there are any surprises with the NBA first, second, or third team within the next few weeks once those are announced. And then finally, the last piece of news that we have to talk about before we get into the NBA playoffs is the NBA draft lottery. I honestly missed when this was happening. I just feel like with the lack of hype and excitement around the draft lottery this year, it was pretty easy to miss. I think they put it in the middle of the day on Mother's Day or something like that, which was kind of weird, and I was traveling that day. So whatever, man. The NBA draft lottery results, it was really shocking. Not that as many people care about that with this being a relatively weak draft class, but I did want to go through the draft lottery order because there was a huge surprise at number 1. Number 14, Portland. 13 was Sacramento. Number 12 pick, Oklahoma City. 11, Chicago. 10, Utah. 9, Memphis. 8, San Antonio. 7, Portland. 6, Charlotte. 5, Detroit. 4, San Antonio. 3, Houston. 2, Washington. And with the number 1 overall pick, the Atlanta Hawks. They only had a 3% chance of snagging that number 1 overall pick, which is wild. I mean, again, they were literally a play-in team, right? Like most years they would not be competing in any sort of, postseason action, whatever you want to consider the play-in, I guess. But either way, that is really shocking to see Atlanta jump all the way up to number 1. This would be a massive deal if, again, this draft class wasn't considered to be very weak. I think it is kind of funny. I'm kind of glad, honestly, that if the Hawks were to get super lucky and then just literally win the lottery with 3% odds, that they did so in a year in which the draft class is considered to be pretty weak, because that's an undeserving team, in my opinion. I don't think any team let me down as much as the Atlanta Hawks did when I had my preseason picks. I expected the Hawks to be like a top 4 or 5 seed in the Eastern Conference, and they weren't even close to that. They were super disappointing, but I do think it is worth noting, because I've already mentioned this a few times on this podcast. Again, this draft class is supposed to be extremely weak. I don't know really anything about this draft class. I don't pretend to be a draft expert, especially with, all the bandwidth I have is kind of sucked up into watching League Pass in the regular season as it's happening. I don't watch a ton of college basketball, and I certainly don't pay attention to really anything that's going on overseas. And it seems like all the top prospects, or at least the top, 2 or 3 prospects in this draft, are expected to come from overseas. But to give you guys some perspective on how bad people are saying this draft class is, I know Russillo reported this on his podcast that he spoke with several front office execs, and they said it was like a normal draft class if you just remove the top, between 7 and 8 prospects. That's kind of crazy to think about, right? Because really there's usually at least a upper echelon of, 1 guy, 2 guys, 3, 4 guys that are, you can kind of build your franchise around, or at least there's that level of potential with some of these guys. So the fact that you remove the top 8 picks allegedly with this current draft class, with the talent level that we're looking at, that's pretty damning. I personally think that is likely going to be a bit overblown, because it's just more of a letdown, I feel like, because we are just the year after a generational prospect in Victor Wembanyama. There's going to be a letdown no matter what. So I feel like this has to be a little overblown. Plus, it looks like Cooper Flagg, the guy that's going to Duke next year, is projected to be the number 1 overall pick for 2025. And I know there's been a lot of hype around him. I'm sure the NBA is fired up to have a white American as a potential number 1 overall pick. That really has never happened. I was just genuinely curious the last time we had a white American projected to go number 1, and the last time that actually happened was 1974 with Bill Walton. So it's been a minute for us white guys in America here. So anyways, maybe you're excited about that, maybe not. But either way, there is a really exciting prospect, at least one on the board, who is projected to go number 1 overall next year, and there's nobody in this year's class that rivals that. But again, I think overall there's going to be really good players out of this draft class. And especially when you look at the talent in the modern NBA, 2 of the top 3 players in the world on really anybody's list came outside of the lottery, right? You look at Giannis. I guess Giannis was he 13 or 14? But late lottery pick for Giannis. Jokic is a second-round guys. And then the list goes on and on, right? You got guys like Donovan Mitchell, who were outside of the top 10 picks, Klay Thompson, Kawhi Leonard. There's so many guys that are super mega stars that came outside of the lottery, that came outside of the top 10 picks. And even if you don't get that, the guys that you build your franchise with, some really quality role players every single year, are found in the late first round, sometimes even the second round as well. So there are going to be productive players in this year's draft class. That much I am certain of. I have no idea who they are, and I'm not sure any NBA teams do either. So it'll be interesting to see if Atlanta wants to make a move, if what they could get for the number one overall pick. It's interesting. There's been a lot of conversations I've had anecdotally over the past couple days of people being like, hey, would you rather have like Michael Porter Jr. or the number one overall pick? Would you rather have Austin Reeves or the number one overall pick? It sounds kind of funny when you say it out loud, but like that's kind of the level of talent that it sounds like we're looking at. So anyway, it's worth the noting that Atlanta got super lucky. Detroit and Portland were probably the big losers there with the number 5 and 7, despite having some of the best odds to have that number one overall pick. And so Atlanta got super lucky. So that's really the highlight of the NBA draft lottery. We'll talk more about the draft as it gets closer. I can't promise to ever be an expert on it, but I'll definitely give my thoughts and be here on Words with Wallace once the draft happens. So now that that is all out of the way, let's talk about the playoffs, man. Let's talk about round 2. And we're going to start off with far and away the most boring series of round 2, which was my Boston Celtics versus the Cleveland Cavaliers. Of course, the Celtics came out and won this series in 5 games, kind of like I expected. But what I was not expecting was to go to the only game, which was, of course, game 2, in which the Celtics absolutely sucked. I mean, at least game 2 against Miami, there was the allure of hope, right? Like, I think it was a little bit closer down the stretch, and the Celtics somewhat were in that game in the fourth quarter, where game 2 versus the Cavs, like, that shit was over pretty quick. It was horrible. Like, we were all just sitting there waiting for the Celtics to like make their late game rally, and it just never happened. At least I got to be in the building for a masterclass Donovan Mitchell game. I mean, that dude was electric in person, I must say. Like, Derek White had his first bad game in like 3 months. It was really tough, man. So I'm glad that I got my bad luck out of the way. I don't have any immediate plans to go to any more Celtics games this season, unless we get Maverick Celtics, in which I will definitely go to at least one of those games. So hopefully I won't be bad luck if that ends up being the case. But moving back on to the Celtics-Cavs series, the Celtics have gotten a lot of heat for the luck that they've received in this playoffs, the injury luck going for the Celtics in this case, especially with everything that the Cavs dealt with during that series. They had no Jarrett Allen for the entirety of the series, no Donovan Mitchell for the last 2 games of the series after he was unbelievable in the first 3 games, and then finally no Caris LeVert to top things off in the final game of the series as well. And so what did that really tell us about Cleveland, about the Celtics in this series? Let's start off with the Cleveland side of things. I just feel like Mitchell's value probably went up a good deal, right? I think he was absolutely amazing all playoffs long, not just in the series against Boston. He was fantastic against Orlando as well. 30 points per game, 5 rebounds, 5 assists on 48% shooting from the field and 35% shooting from 3. I think it's pretty clear that, look, whenever you think about Donovan Mitchell, I feel like he was probably just a bit undervalued over the past, year, 2 years at this point in time. I know he took some playoff lumps with the Jazz and everything like that, but he's always had some good big games in the playoffs as well. And frankly, if I'm Cleveland, I'm obviously doing anything I can to re-sign him, right? It's really tricky because he is under contract for this upcoming season, and the real decision is going to be made after that. So if they can somehow find a way to pay him any possible dollar they can and get that extension inked this offseason, then that is obviously the best case scenario for the Cavs. I think that as much as I like Darius Garland and some of the other pieces on the team, and even I report on this podcast, I thought Donovan Mitchell was going to get dealt at the trade deadline this past year, and that ultimately that didn't end up happening. I think now that we've come this far, like, it was never really about not wanting a guy like Donovan Mitchell on your team. It was just more about, is this guy invested in being here, staying in Cleveland? And that, of course, remains to be seen. But there's no doubts about this guy's talent. I don't know if he can be the best player on a championship team, but I think he can definitely be, your number 2 guy in the perfect situation. But ultimately, it's really hard to win a title, so you just want to keep guys that can put up 30 points a game in the playoffs. If you can have at least one of those guys on your team, you'd want to take that. So really impressed with what I saw from Mitchell, even though unfortunately he did get banged up for the last few games of the Boston series. Unfortunately for Darius Garland, like, he just never really got it going in the playoffs. I mean, I know he did have that one 30-point game after Donovan Mitchell was out. I think that was game 4, right? But even that, I kind of like looked at the box score afterward, was like, he had 30. Like, I don't know, it didn't feel like a very loud 30 points. If I'm being too nitpicky, you guys can definitely let me know. But either way, he just never really got it going. I think that he is a pretty big candidate to be moved. Like, I just think the experiment between him and Mitchell doesn't make a lot of sense. And so, again, if they are able to go with option A and re-sign Donovan Mitchell, I think it would make sense for them to move on for Darius Garland. But who knows? If they don't re-sign Mitchell, you kind of want to hold on to Garland as well. But I think there'd be a ton of teams that would love to get a player like Darius Garland. I think he would be a trade candidate if they are able to re-sign Donovan Mitchell. And I think teams like the Spurs, teams like the Magic would be dying to get their hands on a guy like Darius Garland, because it just doesn't really make sense the way he declined this year. All in all, he definitely had a much better season last year. So, and then finally, Evan Mobley showed some real flashes in the Boston series. I know a lot of his points were kind of like easy ones and transition looks and whatever. But again, without Jared Allen in the lineup, he was playing the five for Cleveland, and it seems like that's his best position, man. Like, I think a lot of the offensive frustration with Mobley is just him not taking that leap, not being able to create his own shot, not being able to consistently make jump shots at a high level. And I don't know if he necessarily changed any of those narratives in the Celtics series, but like he did just look really comfortable still protecting the basket as a five while being a really fluid athlete on the other end, always making the right decisions. And I think he got up to 21 points per game against the Celtics in that series. And so I don't know. I just really liked what I saw from Mobley. He was a real bitch to score on down low as well. So I think it is time to move on from Jared Allen. And again, that's no disrespect to him, but Mobley is younger. Mobley has a higher ceiling, and it just doesn't really make sense to play two non-shooting bigs next to each other, especially in this modern era of the NBA. So finally, the closing thoughts on the Celtics series. Like ultimately, again, they ended up winning in five like I thought they would. I figured Cleveland would get hot for a game and beat them, but I didn't expect it to be a total beatdown in which I was forced to be in the building for. But it was really nice to see them close the series on a high note. I was really impressed with how they closed game five. I know that they took a lot of shit for like Cleveland being in the game late in game five without LeVert, without Mitchell, without Jared Allen, whatever. But the reality is, it's like this NBA rosters are deep, dude. This is, again, I think it's the deepest level of talent we've ever seen in the NBA this season as it's going on. And when you have guys like Marcus Morris that are just thrown back into the rotation playing against their former team, and he was unconscious, like unbelievable in game five. He had over 20 points. I think he literally didn't miss for like three quarters. I'm sure he finished the game with a couple of bricks in there, but he was fantastic for the Cavs. So he got red hot. But guess what? The Celtics had to close out a couple of close fourth quarters, which they obviously did not have to do in round one. And so it was just nice to see them get tested in a way that they haven't yet. So, and it was a really positive game five. Al Horford was magnificent after he was hunted all series long by Cleveland. And so it was really positive to see Al have a monster game on both ends of the court. Finally, the 3-point jump shot was falling as well. So I don't think I could ask for much more from the Celtics than what they showed in game five. And I think it's good that they were in a couple close games, right? They actually had to pull out some games in the fourth quarter. It wasn't necessarily like down to the wire, super clutch situations where they, prove the haters wrong or anything like that. But it was a step in the right direction for the Boston Celtics. Let's move on and talk about Mavericks versus Thunder. Of course, the Mavericks were able to pull out this series win in 6 games, and I will give myself a little bit of credit for this series in particular, because if there was any series that went exactly how I thought it was this series. And not to say I wasn't impressed or didn't enjoy watching this series by any means, but I did predict Mavericks in 6 games, and I just felt like OKC was like a piece or two away. And especially with how Dallas, like the confidence that they had taking care of the Clippers in round one, even with Luka's injury, I just still felt like the Mavs were the team to beat in that series. And, ultimately them not having home court advantage didn't really end up making a real difference. And ultimately, Game 6 was a really competitive game, probably the most fun game of the entire series, and it was kind of a questionable end to the series. I think it was a pretty controversial call that resulted in Shai Gilgeous-Alexander fouling PJ Washington on a corner three when the Mavericks were actually down 1 at that point, so they needed a basket. Closing seconds of the game, Luka actually has a miserable offensive possession where he just tries to start posting up from like the 3-point line, like spins a few times, loses his balance, throws a grenade to PJ Washington in the corner. Shai's closing out, literally blocks the shot, and then like on the follow through, PJ still has the ball. He gets a piece of PJ's arm, and then they call a foul. Obviously, OKC challenges it, or they review it, whatever, and ultimately it is ruled a foul. I understand why it was called that way, especially after the review. Like, he did get his arm, because he didn't release the ball yet, it was still technically considered a foul. I just don't like in the moment that was called a foul. Like, I know the ref was right there and probably saw it, but like in real time, that shit did not look like a foul whatsoever. It looked like that possession was going nowhere fast. Shai, you can make fun of him for fouling the guy or whatever, but he was fantastic all series long. He was really great on defense as well. And for him to close out, and I know PJ Washington had a pretty rough shooting game before that, but he did have a clutch 3 a few possessions before as well. And you definitely don't want to leave anybody open in the corner in that situation when it can end your season. So I'm not going to give Shai any shit for closing out on him, but it just sucked to see it end that way. I do think the right team won. I think Dallas was the better team for really that entire series, and I think they would have won Game 7 either way, but I do feel for any Thunder fans that are pissed to see their team lose that way. So ultimately, it did, again, look like OKC was one guy short. It looked like they needed really another wing as well as a big, right? I've been preaching all year long for them to get a backup big man, and it was definitely an issue on the boards as well. They were out rebounded every single game of the series besides game one. And frankly, just like watching the games, it felt a little bit worse than what the numbers said as far as the rebound differential. Like it just seemed like in clutch spots, like there were times like the Mavericks had such convincing box outs on the Oklahoma City Thunder on both ends of the court where the ball literally hit the ground before anybody went and grabbed it. Like it was like they were doing a drill in practice. Like they were obviously, Lively, Gafford, whoever is able to move Chet because does have such a slight frame, and they really have a size advantage at every single other position on the court. And so that was a huge loss, but really like the lack of wing depth as well. And the main story for OKC is just like the downfall of Josh Giddey, right? Like he was abysmal this series, really unplayable. He had 6 points per game on 12 minutes per game. He got moved to the bench for the first time in his entire career, in which he was coming off the bench for, I think it was starting in like game four, like the last few games of the series, he was coming off the bench. And it made sense. Like their best lineups, it involved Shea, it involved Jalen Williams, it involved Chet, and then it involved Dort, and then either, Cason Wallace, Isaiah Joe, even Wiggins out there probably gave you more than what Josh Giddey did because Dallas did not respect his outside jumper for good reason. And like if you're not running the offense through him, like what is he really doing for you? Like he's nothing special on the defensive end. He could help OKC on the boards because frankly he's like the second biggest dude on the team, and so maybe that could have helped. They found a way to play Giddey a bit more, but his confidence was shot. The team clearly didn't trust him at that point, and so he is the obvious, trade candidate on this Thunder team. Like again, they have such a treasure chest of picks. Like I think my frustration with the team was I wasn't preaching for them to trade Giddey at the deadline necessarily, but it was like instead of Gordon Hayward, like can you get Gafford, who would totally swing that series, obviously, right? Can you get Nick Claxton? Can you get some other body out there to get you a few extra rebounds to relieve Chet, to be a little bit bigger and more physical than the other Jalen Williams, who's currently their backup big man? Those were the questions that I had about the Thunder, and ultimately that ended up being their downfall. So I think the final observation from OKC's end was that it wasn't Shea's fault, right? Shea was actually far and away the best player in the series. I know, again, Luka is obviously a bit banged up, so that's a caveat there, but it's the playoffs, man. Most people are banged up at this point. Shea looked fantastic. Mr. Consistent all regular season long. Continued that bit during the playoffs here, right? He had over 30 points in every single game of this series against Dallas. He was the best player in the series, and I just think even defensively, like I felt like some of the stuff of Shea's defense was a bit overblown. Like he got some like considerable amount of like all defense votes, which I was like, all right, guys, I know we all love Shea, but I feel like that's taking it a bit far. And I stand by that. I don't think he was like all defense level this regular season, but he is really good. Like him being 6'6", him being able to play lanes and really crafty when he decides to gamble. Like there was no way that Dallas was going to be like hunting Shea Gilgeous-Alexander in any way, shape, or form. And for how much he gives you on the offensive end, if he's just above average on defense, which he clearly is, that is a huge win. So loved what I saw from Shea. But ultimately, the Mavericks were just a bit tougher, had more experience, and the Mavericks supporting cast just dominated OKC supporting cast. Like if you look at like the 3 through 7 or 3 through 8 in this matchup, it is like a clean sweep of what Dallas was able to do. Like Derek Jones, Derek Lively, Gafford, PJ Washington, they absolutely dominated the likes of Josh Giddey, Isaiah Joe, Dort, Wiggins, Cason Wallace. Like Wallace actually did have some moments defensively, but in general, it was just a clean sweep by the Mavericks supporting cast, and that ended up being the difference in the series, even though Luka and Kyrie were mostly kept in check. Let's move on, and we're kind of going in chronological order in which these series ended here, to the first Game 7 yesterday, which of course was Pacers versus Knicks. Now, I, of course, was very wrong on this series, but I didn't necessarily see the landslide of injuries for the New York Knicks continuing for as much as they did. And ultimately, the Pacers were able to win in 7. And unfortunately, the story of, again, this series was the injuries for the New York Knicks. They lose OG in Game 2, and I know he did technically play yesterday. He played 5 minutes, actually made his first couple shots, and then clearly like re-aggravated the hammy or just wasn't comfortable going back in the game and didn't end up playing the rest of the game. They lose Mitchell Robinson in Game 1, and ultimately just a slap in the face to the Knicks fans. They lose Jalen Brunson halfway through Game 7 yesterday. I do think they were down by like 15, 20 points at that point in time, so it ultimately would not have made a difference in the game. It wasn't like Brunson had it going, but it just sucks for a dude that I guess Brunson notably isn't on Team USA to my knowledge, and definitely should be in place of Tyrese Halliburton for that matter. So it does suck that I can't imagine a broken hand he would be ready to play in any sort of international competition anyway. So I guess it's a silver lining he wasn't actually on that team, but it just sucks. It sucks to see a guy like Brunson, who was so amazing during the postseason, go down with injury in the final game of the year. And then even Josh Hart and Isaiah Hartenstein, two of the few healthy New York Knicks. Like Josh Hart really banged up his ribs in probably game 5 and then again re-aggravated him in game 6 and was really whooped in game 7. Hartenstein was battling injury as well. So I'm really just tired of talking about the Knicks injuries, and I'm sure Knicks fans are tired of hearing about it as well. But it really makes you ask the question, how much of this is just bad injury luck on behalf of the Knicks, or how much of it can be attributed to Tom Thibodeau's coaching style? And it's really tough to evaluate. And I think that, people, look at Tibbs and they see how much he plays his guys and rides them and whatever. I do think in the playoffs, like, I don't think there was anything else he could have turned to, especially by the time we got to the Indiana series. Like, he was so desperate for guys. Like, Alec Burks is back in the rotation and actually looked pretty good. But there really wasn't anybody else for him to turn to at that point in time. Like, maybe you could have gone to Jericho Sims a little bit more if you were feeling frisky or whatever. But the problem wasn't in the playoffs, right? The problem with Tibbs is the regular season, man. There's 82 games, and he is riding his core 4 guys for 35 plus minutes a game, no matter what. Like, once you are one of Tibbs' guys, one of the few guys that he feels comfortable with, he is going to ride you into the ground. And he did that with Jalen Brunson. He did that with DiVincenzo. He did it with Josh Hart. He did it with OG Anunoby, who has a pretty lengthy injury record at this point in time. So, as much as I do feel bad for Knicks fans, I thought the better team did not win that series because New York at full strength, I think, takes care of that Pacers team pretty easily. But ultimately, it was too many injuries to stomach, right? And I didn't even mention the fact that all those injuries I just named were joining Julius Randle and Bogdan Bogdanovic on the injury report. So it's just an absolute nightmare. But I do think that Tibbs has to shoulder some of the blame. Like, I don't know how you can do blame pie for injuries or what that would look like, but Tibbs is getting a good chunk of that pie, we will say, because there's no way that many guys go down with like fatigue-related injuries, namely with OG Anunoby's hamstring, if they are not literally ridden into the ground by the time the playoffs even start. And then when this first series of the playoffs, round 1, goes 6 games, and is a very physical series, especially with the way the officiating has been this playoffs, like, it's no surprise that this many guys are going to get banged up. So I just can't say, like, there's bad injury luck with all teams, but I do think the Knicks are particularly responsible because of the coaching staff and what they put those guys through. Meanwhile, going back to yesterday's game, the Pacers just really dominated from start to finish. Like, they just could not miss. They finished the game shooting 67% from the field and 54% from 3. And frankly, I think that was brought down like a lot in the fourth quarter once the game was already out of hand. Like, I think for most of the game, the Pacers were shooting like 70% from the field. And really, it just came down to the fact that it was not the same Knicks defense that we saw to start the playoffs, right? It was not a really tough, gritty defensive team at that point in time. Like, these dudes were just exhausted. Like, Josh Hart's moving gingerly. Donte DiVincenzo's moving gingerly. Obviously, OG Anunoby's not even out there. Like, it was just blow-by city, left and right. Whoever was attacking the basket for the Pacers, whether it was Halliburton, whether it was Nembhard, whether it was TJ McConnell, who was magnificent for the Pacers all series long off the bench, like, they were getting by the first guy. And then when the team is just playing with confidence and the team is playing with the pace of Indiana and it's shooting the ball like that from 3, like, it's no wonder that this game was over from the start. So if you're a Knicks fan, it is a really heartbreaking loss, especially to have Game 7 in front of that amazing crowd at Madison Square Garden. I still feel like you have to be happy as a whole with how the season went. Like, there's a lot of positives to look at. Like, you suddenly have like a top 10 player in the NBA. Like, I'm pretty confident in saying that Jalen Brunson is currently a top 10 player in the NBA, which is absolutely insane to think about. You also have an incredible like identity at this point in time, and the Nova Knicks and like this core group of guys that like really loves playing with each other, and it really couldn't be more obvious. And then the Garden's rocking and in full force. They have this incredible section of all the Knicks alumni that every single game you see Stephon Marbury out there, you see Carmelo Anthony out there, you see John Starks out there. Like, they had such an incredible alumni section that no other team has been able to replicate. It's really awesome to see. And then finally, you have a lot of moves to make if you do want to get competitive, right? Like, you have draft picks, you have Julius Randle and his salary to throw around out there. Like, I know that the Knicks had a really great playoff run, but I do think there could be a bit of a Ewing theory here with the defensive identity of this team, at least through the start, through the first round series, we'll say. Once injuries obviously caught up to them against Indiana, like I said, they weren't the same defensive team. But I do think like the upside and the pace at which the Knicks played at, the defensive identity of the team is a bit different without Randle there. So if you can get Mikal Bridges by any means necessary, like, that's the obvious fit to complete, the foursome of the Nova Knicks and whatever else. Like, and I'm actually would be a bit scared for Mikal Bridges if Tibbs got his hands on him, right? Like, 82 games every single year of Mikal Bridges' career, I'm pretty sure. Like Tibbs is going to be like, all right, let's see what 48 minutes per game looks like on 82 games played every single year. Like he would literally never pull Mikal out of the game, but he would be an awesome fit for this team, and I am excited to see what the Knicks do in the offseason. So that's enough for this series. We'll obviously talk more about the Pacers in a little bit when we preview the conference finals. We have to move on to the best series of the playoffs so far, and it's not even close. Wolves versus Nuggets. The Wolves shocked the world, man. I can't believe, even after I know the last time we talked, the Wolves were up 2-0, and I kind of pivoted and kind of suggested that at this point, Minnesota has to be the favorite. I'd be pretty surprised if they lost. Right after I record that, of course, the Wolves end up dropping 3 consecutive games to the Denver Nuggets. Denver has a 3-2 lead. Wolves come out in game 6 and just beat the brakes off them. And even in game 7, man, even yesterday, for them to be down 15 points at halftime, Anthony Edwards never had it going. There was never that one guy, any guy for that matter, that got blindingly hot from 3 and suddenly cut the lead down. No, they just played really fantastic, consistent basketball the entire third and fourth quarter for that matter, and were able to pull off an upset and a comeback against Denver that I genuinely did not think was possible. Like, I was sitting there at halftime, I'm watching the game with Jess, and, they're down 15 or whatever, and maybe it was even this, early on in the third quarter when it got up to like 20 at one point, I want to say. And Jess is asking me, she's like, is it over? And I'm like, I'm not going to say it's over because there's a lot of time left, but it's certainly not looking great. And I literally said, I'm like, if this was Denver, if Denver was the one that was down, I would feel differently because Denver has been able to mount these comebacks many times in the past. They're playing in front of their home crowd, but I'm like, it's the Wolves. It's the Wolves. Like, their offense hasn't been that consistent all season long. And not only that, Anthony Edwards doesn't have it going. He's had it going. He's had multiple 40-point games this series. And last night was not one of them. He was abysmal to start the game. He wasn't making shots. Denver was throwing so much pressure at him. They were throwing 2, sometimes even 3 guys at Edwards on certain possessions. They were just like, you are not going to beat us. And even on the looks that Anthony Edwards did get, they didn't look good. He literally airballed multiple jumpers. He even on a couple different fast breaks, like deferred and like in transition looks where he should just never give it up no matter what because he's so dynamic in transition. He's like dropping the ball off to Rudy Gobert and he did it 2 different times. Like, I couldn't believe it. Like, he looked totally out to lunch. And as much as I love Anthony Edwards, and I do, I was like, the knock on Anthony Edwards is just that, again, he's not only is he 22 years old, he's just not at that same level of consistency that you would see for some of these star players in the NBA in their absolute prime. Like, he's not like a Jokic, which is not a detriment. It's not a negative against Anthony Edwards that he's not as good as Jokic right now. But even on Jokic's off nights, like, he's getting his stats. He's getting the 20 points. He's making all the right plays. Like, I just feel like Anthony Edwards, there's a chance you kind of rattle him and he's not all the way there. But he powered through whatever he was going through in yesterday's game. I know he finished 6 of 24 from the field, but he was magnificent to close the game. He made the right plays, and defensively, he was a monster on Jamal Murray. I can't believe that the Wolves pulled that off, man. For them to go out, not have home court, have the odds stacked against them, and they just beat what I think is the best player in the world and the best team in the world, man. I thought Denver really was the best team, and they beat them without home court, without any fluky injury luck, right? Like, they had the Jamal Murray shit after game 2 where people said he should have been suspended after throwing the heat pack and throwing the shit onto the court. I don't think he should have been suspended, but I'm sure there's some Wolves fans and there's a real argument to be made that he should have. And guess what? It didn't happen. And it didn't matter because the Wolves were able to find a way either way. So I just think it's insane. Like, I think it's my favorite series ever in which none of the games actually came down to the wire, right? Like, even in game 1 and even last night, I wouldn't say there were like super clutch, super high pressure situations where like game was on the line with one possession. I mean, it was obviously really competitive and there was still a ton of pressure on those teams, but there was never like a make or break singular play throughout that whole game because, at that point, Minnesota was up by 8-10 points to close the game. And I'm like, looking around, everyone's waiting for Denver to make this run, but I'm like, I just don't think it's possible with the way that Minnesota plays defense. And ultimately, it never ended up happening. Like, this series was fantastic to watch, and it just kind of shows how unpredictable basketball is, right? It's just so game to game. Like, game 1, you get an incredible ant game. The Wolves are pretty steady throughout. They find a way to win. Game 2, the Wolves just annihilate Denver, absolutely murder them. Then I obviously come on my podcast here. Game 3, Denver wakes up. The role players play well. It's the only good Michael Porter Jr. game you get all season long, or all series long, I should say. Game 4, Aaron Gordon goes crazy, and Ant is the only one that shows up for the Timberwolves. And, of course, the Nuggets win that one as well. Game 5 is a Jokic masterclass. Yeah, I think he had 40-something points. He's just working Rudy Gobert like a speed bag, right? Like they had Rudy Gobert in isolation on Jokic as like the primary defender, which I think that was really the only game they went to that, right? Because most of the time it was Cat doing a pretty solid job on Jokic, and then Rudy was always the one helping, guarding Aaron Gordon. Jokic just works Rudy like a speed bag in game 5. It looks terrible. Of course, game 6, the Wolves just come out and annihilate Denver, and then, we just covered game 7. So every single game was totally different than the game before. It's so unpredictable, and I know that Jokic is going to get a ton of shit for it. I wasn't super online today, so to speak, but I'd imagine that Jokic is getting absolutely torched right now because there's so many people out there bitter about the fact that he did get his 3rd MVP in 4 years, bitter about the way he approaches the game and not being as likable as some other NBA stars that we have out there. And just, once people get a certain level of fame and notoriety and respect, there's just so many people lining up to tear those guys down. And so I'm sure Jokic is getting a ton of shit, but I don't really see a world in which this is his fault. I know he didn't have the best game yesterday, but ultimately, like, he did everything he could to put his team in a situation to win. Like, Jamal Murray was amazing to start the game. The only knock you could have on Jokic yesterday, and really all series long, is that ultimately the three-point shot just didn't fall for him. I think he shot like 22% from 3 on the series, which is well below what his normal averages are. I know he was kind of forced into shooting more threes than I'd imagine he'd like yesterday, but the Wolves were leaving him wide open and just said, we will live with that. And it seemed like, just in his playoff history that he would usually make some of those bigger shots. But again, Jokic is still deserving of the MVP because that's the regular season award. He's still the best player in the world, and he still silenced a lot of haters, right? Like I said, especially in that game 5, he literally dominated the defensive player of the year. And I think even after games 1 and 2 of the series, he even improved his defense a little bit. It seemed like he had no resistance for Ant around the rim in the first couple games of the series, and I feel like he was able to correct that a little bit as well. So I'm still super high on Jokic. This ultimately just ended up being a miserable matchup for the Denver Nuggets. If you look at the 2 through 7 on the Nuggets compared to the 2 through 7 on Denver, it's night and day, man. Not a single player in the Wolves rotation had a bad series. Not a single one. Like, you can start at the top with Ant and you could go, I mean, obviously there were guys that had individually bad games in that stretch, but Ant all the way down to Nickeil Alexander-Walker, like, all those guys played fantastic that entire series. Meanwhile, Denver really never established anybody off the bench that gave them, consistent minutes that they trusted. I think Christian Braun overall had a pretty solid series, but like, besides that, like, you kind of lucked into some, Justin Holiday minutes in there, which was great, I guess. But like, I really thought Peyton Watson was going to be the guy that would step up with how well he played during the regular season. Ultimately, Mike Malone didn't trust him in the playoffs. And then, like, Michael Porter Jr. was just terrible that series, man. Like, I think he finished with 10 points per game on the series. Like, he shot, well under his normal percentage from 3 as well. Like, I think if there's any guy in the core rotation for Denver that's on the hot seat that becomes the trade candidate, I have to imagine it's Michael Porter Jr. because we know what he is at this point in time, right? Like, there was this allure around him. Like, he obviously had a ton of pedigree and was super highly recruited all throughout high school and early college. And then the injury stuff is the only reason he fell to Denver in the first place, who was, I think, in the late lottery at that point in time. But at this point, like, he's just kind of a 6'10" sharp, right? Like, he's 6'10", he can shoot the hell out of the ball, he can shoot over anybody, and he can be kind of like in some cases, like an irrational confidence guy that you want to have out there. But I don't even know if he necessarily fits that mold, because at the end of games, like, the ball is not finding him, all that much. And even last year in the playoffs, I don't think he impressed a ton. Like, I think it was just the greatness of Jokic and Murray as to why they pulled it off last year. So I don't think Denver necessarily goes out of their way to make a move and get rid of Michael Porter Jr., but if they did make a move to one of their core guys, I think MPJ has to have the hottest seat. So that does just about do it for the round 2 recap, and now we have to preview the conference finals. Now, like I said before, I actually had the chance to go back to Boston last weekend with Connor and the guys. Great time. Had the opportunity to listen to some real, authentic Boston sports talk that I am not exposed to here in the Dallas area. And I've heard an overwhelming amount of people in that experience, and then also just in the normal sports media that I consume on a week-to-week basis here, overwhelming number of people just really ripping the Celtics apart. What mainly the storyline and the main sentiment that I've heard along with the Celtics criticism is people complaining about the Celtics' easy road in the playoffs so far, complaining about their easy path to the finals, and discussing how this could be a detriment to the team because they haven't been challenged. I just want to say first and foremost that if anybody is unironically making those points, it's probably because they have to talk about the Celtics in some capacity. Like, either a producer told them they have to talk about the Celtics. Obviously, the sports talk radio hosts in Boston have to talk about the Celtics. That's quite literally their job. Because if you wanted to make real basketball content over the past couple weeks, you just have to really gravitate most of that to what's happening in the West, right? The Dallas OKC series was great. The Minnesota Denver series was great. But if you wanted to just talk about something with the Celtics and like poke a hole in them, like you're grasping at straws because there's not much to talk about with this team right now. There isn't. And these arguments absolutely suck because there is nothing to talk about with this team. Sure, the Celtics sucked in game 2, in which I was in the building for. I know firsthand. They were awful in that game. But guess what? Let's zoom out a little bit. They're 8-2 in the playoffs. And it really doesn't even matter because of those 8 wins, I think, 2 of them have been remotely competitive. They've all been blowouts. They've been doing exactly what they are supposed to do. And you know what else teams are supposed to do when you absolutely kick everybody's ass during the regular season and win 64 games over the span of 6 months or whatever? You're supposed to get an easy road to the playoffs, or at least an easy couple of matchups. And I know people are looking at the long list of injuries of the teams that the Celtics have played. First of all, they didn't play the Knicks, the most injured team in the NBA so far, and they are not going to have to play the Knicks. So I guess that's a win within itself for the, Celtics playing a competitive team narrative or whatever you want to call it. But that being said, the Celtics, yes, they beat the Miami Heat in round 1, and the Heat did not have Jimmy Butler or Terry Rozier. But would it have made a difference? Like, the Miami Heat, I understand they have this aura and this legacy about them because they made it to the finals last year. But again, if they weren't dicking around all regular season and found themselves in the 8 seed, then maybe they wouldn't have been in that spot. Maybe they could have gotten themselves a matchup that they could have won without Jimmy Butler and then faced the Celtics once they got him back in a later round or something like that. But because they didn't take the regular season seriously, they didn't have that luxury and they lost. They lost in 5 games, and I think they would have lost in 5 games even if they had Jimmy Butler. That should have been an easy matchup. The Celtics earned that easy matchup with their performance during the regular season. And then you move on to round 2. Did you really think, looking at the playoffs, we've had the playoff matchups for over a month now. Did you look at those matchups between Orlando and Cleveland and really think either of those teams were going to give the Celtics a hard time? I feel bad for Donovan Mitchell. It's unfortunate that he left to injury after 3 games in that series, especially when he was awesome. But they were already down 2-1 at that point in time. The Cavs were not coming back in that series. I don't care who was walking through that door for the Cleveland Cavaliers. It would not have made a difference. And if you want to sit there and criticize what the Celtics are doing and say not only have they had an easy road, but it's going to be to their detriment because they haven't been challenged, that is a literal crock of shit. This is not some ragtag group of rookies who is scraping together their first postseason run. Jason Tatum has been to 6 conference finals. Jaylen Brown has been to 7 conference finals. Al Horford has the 3rd most playoff minutes ever without winning a championship. I'll say that again. The 3rd most playoff minutes ever without winning a championship. That's a lot of minutes. That's a lot of battles, a lot of wars that old Al has been in. And then you look at Jrue Holiday, who's actually won a championship with the Bucks in 2021, who actually knows what it takes to get it done. And they are being challenged as we speak, and they will be challenged against the Indiana Pacers, especially because they're without their 7'3" starting center walking mismatch in Kristaps Porzingis. And I'm not bitching and moaning about the Kristaps injury, because with his injury history, we could have safely assumed at some point this season he was going to get hurt. Between me and you, I'm actually glad that he got hurt when he did. As much as I would have preferred that to be in like March or something like that, I'd much rather him get hurt in early April than late June or early June, we will say. And guess what? We should be getting Kristaps back at some point this series, if not by the finals, and that's all that matters for us. But that is still a significant challenge because you cannot replicate what Kristaps Porzingis does. Al Horford is the man. I love him dearly, but he is no Kristaps. So rant over on that part of the Celtics. I just can't stand the arguments that have been made. I know, again, it's because it mainly due to a lack of content, especially coming from the Eastern Conference matchups. And if you need to make a storyline about the Celtics, you can send some hate their way. But I'm just not really here to hear that. I will say, after Denver lost last night, my perspective on this whole season has changed. I know this might sound bad to say, but I had somewhat mentally accepted the idea of the Celtics making it to the finals and losing to Denver. Even on like my tier rankings, you can go back months, I've talked about the Celtics matchup against Denver and quite frankly being a little scared of that matchup because I don't know how the Celtics would do against the defending champs. That is now out of the question. The Denver is now out of it. And it is now the Celtics, the Pacers, the Mavericks, and the Wolves. The Celtics have far and away the most experience of any group. They have far and away the best record of any group. My expectation is championship or bust. And not only that, I am not, as a human, check in on me. If you have my number and the Celtics lose in the playoffs, call me check in on me because I'm not going to be okay if the Celtics do not win a championship. I have a particularly close connection to three of the teams in the finals. Of course, my Boston Celtics. Of course, the Minnesota Timberwolves, a franchise I used to work for. Lived there for a summer, had fond memories, and know some fantastic people who have been on this podcast through that time with the Wolves. I want to fucking crush Wolves fans. I don't like the Wolves fans. I get it. They're a spunky bunch, and they haven't won anything, and it feels good, and it's great, and they're easy to root for. They're not easy to root for when they're playing my Celtics, man. I do not want to lose to those guys. I don't, because I know them well. I don't want to lose to them. And I certainly don't want to lose to the Dallas Mavericks. I live in the Dallas area. I hate it. I had to fake for years that I gave a shit about any of the local teams. I don't. I wish the worst upon them. I don't want them to win. I do. I do want them to win. I want them to have success. I want them to have just enough success to be right below wherever the Celtics are. That's how I feel about those teams. So and don't even get me started if we lose to the Indiana Pacers, because then the whole season's just a disaster. So the stakes have been raised significantly for my Boston Celtics. But all they can do is take it one series at a time. And for them to do that, they have to start off with the Indiana Pacers. So let's talk about that series. First and foremost, congratulations to the Indiana Pacers for being the worst team in the Final Four in the past 3 seasons. They are the worst team to make it to the Final Four in the NBA since the 2021 Atlanta Hawks, who got there as a beneficiary of the Ben Simmons meltdown in that Philadelphia-Atlanta series of 2021. So I don't like the Pacers. I'm not scared of the Pacers. I don't like them. I felt like they were even lucky to get out of round 1, and here they are in the Eastern Conference Finals. So again, credit to them because they have improved quite a bit since the start of the playoffs, and they've showed me a few things. First and foremost, I do think they've improved their defense a bit. I think there are some things that they do well on the defensive end, which doesn't really sound like much of a compliment, but when you look at their defense during the regular season, it is, right? Like you have guys, individual solid defenders. You have a solid rim protector in Miles Turner. You have a guy in TJ McConnell who's not afraid to get up in your jersey and did a fantastic job by all accounts, guarding Jalen Brunson in that series against the Knicks. They have a few things that you like on the defensive end of the court, and I quite literally mean just a few things. Also, they play a unique style with insane pace, and it involves 5 guys constantly looking to catch and attack the rim. The way that they can dribble drive is better than nearly any other team in the NBA, and it just results in them getting a shitload of open looks, especially when you play against a tired team like the New York Knicks. They can put themselves in a situation once they get these open looks to just, on 3-point variance alone, they can be fantastic. And they can just win any single game just by getting hot from 3. And guess what? They were hot from 3 all series long against the Knicks. I think 6 of their top 8 guys, of the Pacers' top 8 guys, shot 40% or better from 3 that series. That's insane. 6 of their top 8. That includes guys like Obi Toppin was shooting over 40% from 3. Like, what? Where did that come from? I don't know. So hopefully that doesn't continue against the Celtics. But guess what? With the quality of shots that the Pacers generate, they could. So that's all worth noting. But if the Celtics want to shut everybody up and go into the finals with the momentum that they need to win the whole thing, they need to dismantle Indiana. I don't want to just beat the Pacers. I want to crush the Pacers. If it goes any more than 5 games, this series is a travesty for the Boston Celtics. They are far and away the better team, even without Kristaps Porzingis. And guess what? I don't send a lot of hate on this podcast. I keep it pretty professional for the most part. But guess what? I'm becoming more unhinged, right? I've been doing this long enough. My team is hopefully going to be competing for a championship within the next couple weeks here. I hate Tyrese Halliburton. I already hate him, and the series hasn't even started. I'm going full Kendrick Lamar for Tyrese Halliburton. I hate the way that he walks. I hate the way that he talks. I hate the way that he dresses. I hate all those things. He has within every right to switch his voice every third sentence that he says within any interview. He can dress like an idiot. He can dress like a tool if he wants. That's fine. He's well within his right to do that. I also hate the way he plays basketball for the most part, right? I hate the way that he front runs. I hate the way that he only ever talks shit when he's up. He's never that junkyard dog. He's actually quite literally like a puppy when he's down, right? He just doesn't really do or say anything. He quickly disappears out of close games when the team needs him, and his teammates have bailed him out in the past. I hate his ugly ass jumper. I understand he shoots at a good clip. You know, shoot your shot, whatever. He shoots over 40% from 3. I can't deny that it's working. I will deny anyone that says it looks good. It looks like shit. It's a shot put. It's not it sucks. It sucks to look at. I hate watching it. I hate that he's absolutely cheeks on defense. He is booty cheeks on defense. He can't defend. If the Celtics are not putting Tyrese Halliburton in every single action on offense that they can, it is coaching malpractice. if the Pacers are going to hunt Al Horford the way that the Cavs did, which they probably should, right? The Cavs had a lot of success doing that for 4 out of the 5 games last series. If the Pacers do that, then the Celtics should return the favor by hunting Tyrese. I will take that matchup. I will take matchups against Tyrese Halliburton with our Celtics against Tyrese Halliburton versus their Pacers against Al Horford. I will take that matchup 10 out of 10 times. I also hate that Tyrese Halliburton got absolutely bailed out in game 3 of the series against the Knicks when he threw a literal grenade to Andrew Nembhard with like 4 seconds left on the shot clock, and he hit a step back 3 to ultimately win that game and ultimately the series. If Andrew Nembhard doesn't bail out Tyrese Halliburton and make that shot, then we're probably playing the Knicks right about now. So, long story short, I hate Tyrese Halliburton. I also can't stand TJ McConnell for that matter, and I know that if anyone that knows me and has known me long enough know that I played a pretty similar game to TJ McConnell, especially in like high school. Like I couldn't shoot from outside the arc. I only had like a little mid-range thing, and he just works his ass off on defense. And I know that people say like if someone kind of resembles you, like it kind of like it reminds you of like the part of yourself that you hate. That's me watching TJ McConnell. I should like him, but I don't. I already hate him. And don't even get me started on Nesmith. That guy was a bum for the Celtics for like 3 straight years. So anyway, I already dislike them too. So that being said, I do wish the Celtics had like a Marcus Morris-esque guy to just like really just like knock Tyrese Halliburton or Nesmith or TJ McConnell, whoever, on their ass once they start getting a little too shippy with my Celtics, and we don't really have that guy. Maybe Tillman can be that guy. He certainly profiles. He has the body for it. But either way, Celtics in 5. I'm done talking about this series. Celtics in 5. That's exactly what's going to happen in the next round. Moving on to the final series that we are going to be talking about today, the Minnesota Timberwolves versus the Dallas Mavericks. I cannot believe that one of these teams is going to the finals. I can't believe it. Again, obviously, I'm pretty close to both of these teams. I've lived in both these places, had connection with both of these fans. So the fact that one of these teams is actually competing for a finals this year is kind of crazy to me. Before I break down this matchup, I have a long list of apologies for both these teams in this series, because I don't know if I've been as more wrong about any two teams in my relatively brief time doing this podcast. First on the apology list, I'm sorry to Derek Jones Jr. I'm sorry for calling you a bum in my pro Luka MVP argument. You're honestly a dog on defense, and you are a fantastic lob threat, and frankly, you hit just enough threes to keep the defense honest. I went to several Mavericks games this year. I feel like every single Mavericks game that I went to, Derek Jones Jr. combined for like 15 points in those 3 or 4 games that I went to. He was abysmal in all of them. And even when I watched them on TV from time to time, like I didn't see the edge. Like I feel like it was a lot harder for me to notice his defense in the regular season as it was in the playoffs. And I know he got torched by Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, but everybody does. He did a fantastic job against Paul George in round 1. Derek Jones Jr. is a real role player for them and was really crucial in that OKC series. I'm sorry to the Minnesota Timberwolves. I'm sorry for picking against you in 2 consecutive rounds. That looks really bad. They have been the story of the playoffs, and I did not even pick them to beat the Phoenix Suns in round 1. I'm pretty bad at my job. I'm sorry to Nico Harrison, general manager of the Dallas Mavericks, for hating on the PJ Washington trade. This has proven to be the most impactful trade of the season, and PJ Washington is exactly what Dallas needs, and he is also exactly who Grant Williams thinks that he is, right? Everything that you could have said about the Grant Williams signing, which I loved the Grant Williams signing, and I wasn't even a Grant Williams guy when he was in Boston. I know you think I'm being a homer by saying I liked the Grant Williams trade, and I felt like the upgrade from Grant Williams to PJ Washington wasn't that significant. It's proven to be extremely significant. So just want to get that one out there as well. I can't believe I'm doing this. I'm sorry to Tim Connolly, general manager of the Minnesota Timberwolves, for shitting on the Rudy Gobert trade for 2 consecutive years. I can't believe I'm saying this. I was wrong on the Gobert trade. I'm sure everybody was wrong. No matter really what happens in this series, and it is, as I sit here and record, I acknowledge the fact that Dallas could find a way to really scheme things up and play Rudy Gobert off the court in the playoffs and whatever, and do this and that. You beat the defending champs. You beat the best player in the world and what I believe to be the best team in the world in the second round of the playoffs with a very young best player of your team. And Tim Connolly did that mainly in part because he traded for Rudy Gobert. He mortgaged the entire future of the franchise for Rudy Gobert, but guess what? It seems to be working. So I was wrong on that as well. My last apology before we break down the matchups, I am sorry to Kyrie Irving. My first real take on this podcast when I started this thing up like a year and a half ago was shitting on the Mavericks for trading for Kyrie Irving. Not only did the Mavericks find a way to re-sign him, which that was my biggest gripe with the trade in the first place, is there's no certainty that he's going to be anything more than a few month rental for a pretty mid-team last year, but they were able to re-sign him. They got the best season from him in a full, like 5 or 6 years at this point in time. And now they're making a real run at a title with Kyrie as definitely the second most important player on that team. So I am sorry to Derrick Jones Jr., the Minnesota Timberwolves, Nico Harrison, Tim Connolly, and Kyrie Irving. I was very wrong about both of these teams. Glad that's out of the way. Now that it is, this series should be amazing. I'm not going to spend a ton of time predicting this and breaking this down because I've been wrong about these teams from the jump. But I will say, if I had to predict how this series goes, if there is a close game in this series down the stretch, I'm going to like the Mavericks in that game. The shots that they will get from Luka, from Kyrie, and the shots that those guys will create for their teammates, more importantly, is going to be a strong point of the Dallas Mavericks team. It feels like they know who they are. They know who their guys are. PJ Washington's shooting the ball with confidence and is a good third option for them as well. It just feels like they're going to get better shots down the stretch. And what people aren't talking about with this Minnesota Timberwolves team, and for good reason, their weakness all season long, really, especially in the regular season, was late game offense. That was their weakness. Very similar to the Boston Celtics. Their ability to close games down the stretch was questionable, right? Ant wasn't super comfortable with the ball in his hands, or maybe he was, but he didn't have a ton of success closing out games for the Wolves. And Cat was always an idiot and in foul trouble, just like he was yesterday for the most part. But he was fantastic in the series, so I'll give Cat some credit. But it just does seem like if it is a close game, I'm going to like Dallas in the game. However, the way that Minnesota defends, if they defend the same way they did against Denver, they should be able to handle whatever Dallas Mavericks scheme up. They should be able to win this series. Especially if the refs enforce the prison ball rules, like, the lack of whistles that we've seen, especially through the first few games of the Minnesota-Denver series in round 2. If that is the way that this series is called, I expect Luka to just absolutely lose his mind and for the Wolves to just come out and just punch the Mavericks in the face in at least 2 games. I would say at least 2 games play out like this, where Minnesota gets off to a hard start. The Mavs can't compete with the physicality. Luka loses his mind, and the game is basically over by halftime. I think the Wolves win 2 games in this series from a scenario like that alone. So altogether, I think it's going to be a really close series, and I think it just depends on game script for who wins these games. But ultimately, I'm taking the Minnesota Timberwolves in 7 games, and I think we're going to end up getting a Celtics-Wolves finals, which is pretty crazy to talk about. That is going to just about do it for this podcast. This is way too long of an episode for just me. I know you guys would probably love to hear another voice on there, but I'm sorry. This is what you're stuck with for now. I cannot wait to come at you guys next week. Hopefully I will have a guest on. Either way, I cannot wait to break down these conference finals. We should be in for some really awesome basketball to close this season. Before I let you guys go, be sure to follow Words with Wallace on everything. That includes Spotify, Apple Music, wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to follow me on social media as well. That's Words with Wallace on everything. On Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, on YouTube, on TikTok. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss a new episode. Share the show, tell a friend, and I will talk to you guys next week. Peace.